Joining us now, as I said earlier, in the studio is the Sun's excellent defence editor, Jerome Starkey. Welcome, Jerome. I mean, basic question. Could this have been, as Israel say, an accident? Because the convoy was in a protected area. The vehicles had charity insignia on the roofs. What was it? World Central Kitchen. You know, it was they told Israel about it, and yet Israel said they made a mistake. So Israel knew about this convoy, and yet this happened anyway. Is it plausible that that was, as Benjamin Netanyahu said, a tragic mistake?
Well, Kevin, let's be clear what we mean by mistake. There's no suggestion that these missiles were launched by mistake. Somebody pressed the button to fire them 3 times, because we know that the first vehicle was hit. Survivors ran. Some people managed to get out of that vehicle and ran to the other vehicles. The other 2 vehicles were hit. So those missiles were fired deliberately on target. They hit
from a drone.
Soldiers.
From a drone.
That's what we understand, from a drone. What this shows is that the Israeli forces are unable to discriminate between civilian targets and military targets. This is an epic failure on that ability to discriminate. And it's a catastrophic failure, because this was a convoy of aid vehicles coming from a known location where an aid agency was working along a pre-agreed route. And as you've pointed out, these vehicles were clearly labelled as belonging to World Central Kitchen, including with the logo of that charity on the roof of the cars, so that it could be visible to those drones. Now, if you consider nearly 33,000 people have been killed over the last 6 months in Gaza, I think it would be immensely naive to think that this is the first time such a mistake has happened, but it is perhaps the first time such a mistake has demanded, or at least attracted, so much scrutiny from the world. And that's because the victims include, as you've said, 3 former members of the British Armed Forces, Australian national, a Polish national, and a dual US and Canadian citizen, as well as a Palestinian as part of that team. And this was, a huge, reputable charity doing amazing work, trying to stave off a humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. So it is a disaster for the people involved. Clearly, it's a real setback for Israel because of the backlash that it has quite rightly triggered.
I just want to look into some of this a bit more forensically, because the things that we know is that it appears that there was one armed man that they were trying to target, and yet there were 3 separate strikes. It then turned out said armed man, who was suspected of being connected to Hamas, didn't actually go as part of the convoy. We also know that there's basically a 3-degree sign-off before such things happen. When sort of drones fire missiles, it's not just one person getting trigger happy. There is sort of a war legal expert and senior people in the military. There's now rumours, though, that elements of the IDF might be going a little bit rogue and acting indiscriminately, setting up kill zones, because they personally might be motivated by overreaching what the official Israeli strategy is, which is to eradicate Hamas, but to allow that humanitarian aid to get through. Do you think that there is any plausibility to that this could actually be a sort of element of the IDF who are sort of saying, well, we're going to do what we want to do?
Well, look, in my experience of covering civilian casualties, there is usually a combination of a failure of process, but also a failure of culture. And I spent 5 years living in Afghanistan analysing civilian casualty incidents that were largely caused by NATO forces. This isn't a problem unique to the Israeli army. So I would suggest, just on instinct, that this is a problem, a twofold problem. Those processes you've outlined may or may not have been followed, but also I would suggest that after many months of war, particularly when political leaders in Israel have advocated some incredibly robust language in terms of the amount of destruction they want to inflict on Gaza. You'll remember Netanyahu invoking Amalek, which is a biblical verse which describes destroying not just men and fighters, but destroying entire families, farms, animals as well. Those sorts of comments trickle down. They affect how soldiers behave. They affect cultures. And there are very disturbing reports worth reading today in Israel's Haaretz newspaper, suggesting Israeli defense insiders revealing to that newspaper that they believe Israeli soldiers inside the Gaza Strip are behaving as they want, that they're out of control. And certainly that would make sense. I mean, I can't say that as a matter of fact, but that is what has been reported by Israeli sources to an Israeli newspaper, that their own troops in the Gaza Strip are out of control.
Now, you've been to Gaza. I remember we've interviewed you from that war zone, so you know what the terrain is like. Now, from what I can see of this convoy, of the area that it was driving through, it was, by Gaza standards, a fairly open area, apparently protected, so isn't supposed to be a place where they drop bombs or anything like that. But tell us, so the Israelis say, well, you know, these things, Netanyahu actually said these things happen in war, and war is complex. This is a complex situation. It's particularly complex in Gaza because this is just about the most heavily populated strip of land in the world. Tell us about the Gaza terrain and tell us about the complexities that Netanyahu is talking about.
Well, Kevin, first I must say I haven't been to Gaza. I just don't want to mislead your viewers. But in terms of the complexity of that conflict...
I thought we...
Ukraine.
Ukraine. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine.
You just outside Gaza.
Yeah,
no.
Oh, okay. Anyway, sorry. My mistake, everyone.
We're talking about Gaza, but from Ukraine.
Yeah.
Sorry, only because I don't want to mislead.
We were talking to you about
viewers.
Gaza from Ukraine.
Yeah.
There we go. That's my confusion, folks. Carry on, Jerome. Sorry.
Gaza is complicated. All war zones are complicated, but Gaza is also one of the most heavily surveilled areas in the world, both in terms of satellite surveillance, non-stop, round-the-clock drone surveillance, and indeed signals intelligence. You know, Israeli human intelligence. Israel has very good networks and also has the opportunity to soak up all kinds of radio and telecommunications intelligence as well. So Israel should have a very good and detailed picture of what is going on. What is interesting about this incident is really a question of proportionality. Alex, you've mentioned that there was a report, the Israelis suggesting that they thought they'd seen one armed man going into the warehouse, and then they destroyed 3 cars coming out of it. So even if we accept their story on face value, they were prepared to annihilate an entire convoy and its occupants for the sake of one armed man. Now, I question whether that is proportional. I would question how important does one fighter have to be 6 months into a conflict when Israel says it has already killed 13,000 militants? How important does one fighter have to be to justify a strike on 3 cars? Now, as it happened, there was no fighter. And you know, do we agree that there is a justification for seeing someone entering a building and therefore killing anything that leaves that building? Again, it's a question of proportionality, and these aren't new questions. I mean, a legendary former head of the British Army, General Sir Mike Jackson, was raising concerns about proportionality in November, 5 months ago, just a few weeks into Israel's war. That's what this comes down to. And it comes down to a decision that the soldiers and perhaps the lawyers and the politicians have to make about what is proportional, what is justifiable. And what are they going to make that decision to unleash lethal force? And I think what we've seen is that Israel is prepared to unleash huge amounts of lethal force. And I think the world is perhaps taking a moment of reckoning today as they see people that they recognise, people that they love, people that they might have known, victims of that violence.
Yeah, it could be a turning point, I think, in all of this. Jerome, thank you ever so much.
Thanks,
Fascinating to get your expertise and insights.